So this is the fourth in a series of 6 meetings with colleagues from Irish institutions instrumental in the success of Irish agri-food export development. A couple of administrative issues. The main language will be English this morning, and you can find the Ukrainian under the German button. And please leave the microphone muted when you're not speaking. If you have questions during the presentation, if you could just please write them in the chat, and we'll pass them on to Mr. Flanagan at the end. My name is Richard Moody. I'm the agri-trade policy expert on the Agri-Trade Ukraine project. It's funded by the German Federal Ministry of Agriculture and Food. And our project is supporting in various ways the development of agri-food export potential and systems, and in particular to export to the EU within the framework of the DCFTA. We're looking at various ways to improve the system of export, both state and non-state mechanisms. And we're looking to learn from the best and apply the relevant lessons from those successes to the challenges faced by the Ukrainian agri-food sector. So last year we visited Germany and studied the German system, and this year and now we're very much looking forward to hearing about the various elements of the Irish system, including specifically today the role of cooperatives and how they've contributed to the huge successes in supporting agri-food export and turning, for example, the Irish dairy products into a global brand. So with that, I'd like to hand over to Mr. Flanagan to take over. Thanks.
Thank you. You can see my presentation now, can you?
Yes, we can.
That's very good. Thank you. And thanks for the invitation to speak to you this morning. I gather I have about 30 minutes, so I just want to explain some things to you just so you can understand how we see the world. I'll go through a number of slides. I'll talk a little bit about just the Irish agricultural environment as we see it and how we fit into that. I'll explain to you just a little bit about ICOS as an organisation and the cooperative model in Ireland. I'll explain to you why I think cooperatives works particularly well in dairy in Ireland and in the type of dairy environment that we have in Ireland. I'll explain a little bit as well sectors where they haven't worked in Ireland, and maybe we can, in questions and answers, explain why they haven't worked well in sectors. I was also asked to talk a little bit about producer organisations that have been provided for in European law, and then we can have a broader discussion afterwards. So first of all, ICOS is an umbrella body for cooperatives in Ireland, mostly agriculture and food and rural cooperatives, mostly. We have about 130 members, active members who pay ICOS for services and pay us annual affiliation fees. And of those members, if you were to look at those brands that are on the screen, and if you were to Google them, you would see that some of them are very large dairy companies with turnover of over 2 billion, and some of them are medium-sized dairy companies with turnovers of 100 million or 200 million. Some of them are very small livestock marketing cooperatives. Some of them are breed societies. So there's a range of them, and those are just some of the logos of some of our members. So this is ICOS. This is where we're based in Dublin. We're the Irish Cooperative Organisation Society, and we're the central organising body for cooperatives in the Republic of Ireland, which is the largest part of the island of Ireland. So where are we? We're based in Merrion Square. We're down here in the corner of Merrion Square. We're in a very central location, right beside the National Parliament, right beside the Department of the Taoiseach, who's our Prime Minister, and just across from our Department of Agriculture. So we're located in a nice location, but thanks to COVID, there's nobody in the office today, and there's nobody been there for quite some time. And that's some of our staff. We're a small organisation. There's just 15 staff within the organisation, and we're divided across really divisions. There's a policy division, which is 3 of my colleagues who look after policy issues in dairy, in livestock, animal health, animal welfare, and one of my colleagues is based in our Brussels office. I have 2 colleagues who are lawyers who look after governance and legal issues within their cooperatives. So we provide that support to cooperatives around their governance. I have 4 colleagues who work in accounts and finance, because we administer ourselves as an organisation, but we also administer 2 pension schemes for employees of cooperatives. We have a learning and development function. So 3 of my colleagues run training programs for cooperatives, cooperative members and cooperative staff. So every year we deliver training for, well, about 7,000 man days, 7,000 days worth of training to either members or employees of cooperatives, and then 2 colleagues to administer the organisation, plus myself. So that's ICOS. We're a small organisation. Just to understand cooperative regulation in Ireland, what is a cooperative in Ireland? What do we mean by it? Well, first of all, there are about 1,000 cooperatives registered in Ireland, and they are registered differently to companies. So in Ireland, a company is registered under a legal framework called the Companies Act. Cooperatives are registered differently. We have our own piece of legislation, which is very ancient. It's the Industrial and Provident Societies Act from 1893. It's actually a UK Parliament Act, because we didn't have our own government in 1893. So it's a piece of UK legislation, which when we achieved independence in 1921, and from then we have been updating this act all the time. But our central foundation piece of legislation is very old and does need to be updated now. And on almost all the cooperatives in Ireland have what we call an ICOS rulebook. So their constitution, just like a company has a constitution, cooperatives have what we call a rulebook. It's a book that contains generally about 100 different rules that set out how the cooperative is governed. So it sets out what the cooperative can do, what the issues are around the shares, what the issues are around the members, membership, how it's governed, how they elect a board, how they run their general meetings, how shares can be transferred, what happens when there are difficulties and disagreements, how we have arbitration. All those things are in the rule book of every cooperative, and the rule book is copyrighted to ICOS, and we provide the arbitration if there are any disputes. So that's our key function, is to maintain the rule book in all the cooperatives. Just so I don't know how many of you may have visited Ireland or are familiar with it, but you know, we're a small country the size of your neighbours in Latvia. Only 7 million hectares. We're tiny, so that's the scale you're familiar with. Where 10% of our land is used for forestry. We have about 64% of the land in the country is suitable for agriculture. So 4 million hectares, which is quite a small production base. Of that 4 million hectares, 81% of it is used for grass. About another 11% for what we call rough grazing, which is a type of grass again, but on less productive. And only about 8% is devoted to crop production. So it's a very, the countryside does not have much crop production. It's mostly green with grass because of our rain. And you can see a rainy scene there, and you can see the level of rainfall on the island. It's quite high. We have about 100,000 farms. Depending on where you get your statistics, you can see reports of 130 something thousand, but a lot of those would be very small. So there's about 100,000 farmers really, with on average, typically about 40 hectares each. Of those 100,000 farms, really about 30,000, depending on your definition, would be full-time commercial farmers. And the rest, the majority, they're still farming, and many of them are commercial, but they're not full-time. They're not fully dependent on that farming enterprise for their living. So they may be semi-retired, part-time, have an off-farm job, maybe have a wife or a spouse who works full-time, and they combine farming with childcare activities, etc. So the majority do something else as well as their farming. It might be agricultural contracting, it might be involved in agriculture, but it is another substantial source of income. And that's important when you try to understand the agricultural environment in Ireland. We really consider the 30,000 full-time commercial farmers as the ones who contribute most of the production. And that's, I guess, the typical traditional environment in Ireland, which is small fields and lakes and hills and very, very green. And the fields that you see, which are slightly yellow, are where the grass has been harvested. And this is, I guess, a more modern dairy type environment in probably the southern part of the country, where the fields are slightly bigger and divided into paddocks. But the cows are still out most of the year. Just so you understand dairy farming as we see it within Ireland, we have about 17,000 dairy farmers, between 16 and 17,000 dairy farmers. They milk about 90 cows each. That's the typical herd. That number has been growing. 20 years ago, that was probably 60 cows. So that's now growing, and probably the more typical herd size that we now see is probably 120 or 30 cows, which is now seen to be the number that a family farm can manage. A dairy farmer with some help from family and maybe some seasonal help, it's probably 120 or 30 cows. So that's the family farm, because the vast majority of Irish farms are family farms. It's a social and cultural phenomenon as well as an economic one. So we don't have huge farms. Our farms, as I said earlier, typically about 40 hectares, although that is growing now. The average yield for our cows is 5,300 litres per cow. As you will know, any of you that are familiar with dairy, that's a low yield compared to certainly continental European norms, but it is more consistent with the type of agriculture we practice, which is grass-based, cows outside grazing grass, typically quite wet grass. We produce about 8 billion litres. That's our fat and protein content, 4.17% fat, 3.54% protein, which has grown pretty dramatically over the last 10 years due to payment systems that we use. We actually pay the farmer for the kilos of fat and the kilos of protein that they produce. And we actually charge the farmer for every litre of milk that he delivers. Because of our production, we don't want water, we want the solids. So he gets a bill for every litre that he delivers, but he gets paid for the solids content within it. We've a highly seasonal milk supply, probably close to 10 to 1. So we produce 10 times more milk in our peak season, which the peak months are May and June. So we produce 10 times more milk in our busiest month than we do in our quietest month, which is January. Only 6% of our milk is used for drinking. So 94% of our milk is used for manufacturing. And I'll explain a little bit later what it is we manufacture. So actually the milk that you see produced in December and January, particularly January, is only from herds, a small proportion of our herds that specialize in liquid milk production. So they calve their cows, or some of their cows, in the autumn to ensure that they have fresh milk across the winter to supply cooperatives who supply the domestic drinking milk market. The rest of the herds, the vast majority of farms, over 90% of farms, calve their cows in spring and produce most of their milk in the summertime from grass, which is the most profitable thing to do. So we have a unique type of production model, or unique in Europe really. It's closest to New Zealand in world terms. What it does mean is that if you build a factory to make cheese or powder or butter in Ireland, you have to build a factory big enough for the busiest day of the year, which is sometime in May, even though that factory would probably be empty in the wintertime or be operating at 10 or 20% capacity. So actually, if you build a factory in Ireland to make, we'll say, 30,000 tons of cheese in the year, the same factory, if you built it in the US, would make 50,000 tons of cheese because they have a flat milk supply curve, whereas our machines and our factories only operate at about 62% installed capacity. And that's a key feature of the cooperative model, which we can talk about later. It's responsiveness to the needs of farmers. Farmers want to produce milk this way because it's the most profitable way to do so. And the cooperatives have built an industry around the needs of the farmers because the farmers own the cooperatives. And also, just on that graph, you can also see that graph sets out the production and seasonality from 2000 to 2020. You can see the seasonality is probably even getting steeper, but you can see how the production has grown. So our peak month used to be somewhere between 600 and 700 million litres in the peak month, and now it's 1.12 billion litres in the peak month. So you can see how our milk supply has grown since quotas ended. Again, our typical farm in dairy, our production, 90% of our 95% of the consumption of the cows on those farms is from grass, grazed grass or preserved grass. So we have a scheme, I think you may be meeting Board BIA, which is our national food board. They certify a grass-fed standard, which is very important to our marketing and our exports. And that requires that production be from grass, 95% average of the diet of the animals must be grass. The feature is a compact spring calving system. So from late January onwards, the cows calve and they're let out to grass then probably early February when the grass starts to grow. They produce milk from grazed grass a minimum of 240 days outside grazing grass in the year, not housed. The cows that come to the end of their lactation generally in November or early December, depending on how wet the weather is. If the weather is very wet, the cows end a little bit earlier and they're dried off. So when they're in the barns for the winter time, they're typically not milking, they're dry. And there are low levels of purchase feed used. So typically less than 1 ton of purchase feed used per cow per year. And that's an evolution of our milk production since we joined the EEC at the time. We almost doubled our milk supply from 1973 to 1984 when we joined the European Economic Community. When prices rose, milk supply grew dramatically. And then we had milk quotas, which meant that production was stagnant for 30 years. And you can see now how it has grown dramatically since milk quotas ended, and also in the couple of years before quotas ended. I guess you're interested in exports and production. Just on our dairy base, 62% of the milk in Ireland is actually used to make butter. So the first decision that you make when the milk enters the dairy factory is what will we use the fat for, because the fat is the portion that you remove from the milk first. So 62% of that fat is used to make butter, and we make 250,000 tons approximately of butter on our most important markets, Germany, the US, and the UK. 25% of milk is used to make cheese. About 240,000 tons of cheese we make, which is mostly cheddar, which is a cheese beloved of English-speaking countries mostly. So the UK is our biggest market, the EU as well, and the USA. Those are our big markets for cheddar cheese. We are migrating away from cheddar now because of Brexit concerns and the UK leaving the trading bloc, and there is an increasing investment in mozzarella production. but cheddar is still our #1 cheese. We also make about 400,000 tons of dairy powders, and our biggest markets would be China, the Middle East, and North and West Africa. And about 15% of infant formula consumed globally is Irish as well. So we're growing importance in the infant formula market. Although most of all the infant formula that's made in Ireland is made by infant formula companies, not by cooperatives. Cooperatives sell ingredients to the infant formula companies, and it is them that makes the margins, the very high margins in infant formula, not the cooperatives. Just to understand the cooperative model, what does a cooperative mean in dairy? So a cooperative, as we see it, is about collaboration, cooperation, trust, pooling of resources, you know, in this instance, to collect, to process and market milk. You know, why would a farmer be part of a cooperative? In dairy particularly, and for many crops, it's a long and a complex supply chain. And most farmers with 40 or 50 hectares and maybe 100 or 120 cows, they're not in a position to deliver infant formula to China or to deliver butter to Germany or cheese to the US. So they need a trusted partner that isn't different from them. It's part of them. It's a trusted partner that they have a say over and they have control over. So they have their cows, they'll milk their cows, they'll stick it in a bulk tank, and at that, their influence should end. But the milk is collected by, it could be collected by a company, but in Ireland it's collected by a cooperative that the farmer owns and controls, you know, who builds the factory, who deliver the product to China or the US. So it's about getting control of your supply chain. It's about ensuring that the chain, in as much as is possible, is working in your interest, not in the interest of itself. And as I explained earlier, because we have such a seasonal milk supply curve in many other countries, if the dairy processor was a private company or a public company, they would say to the farmer, you need to supply the milk on a flat curve so that we can make the products that we want to make. But because the dairy farmers own the cooperatives, their decision-making structures ensure that the cooperative builds itself and builds its structures and builds its markets around what's best for the farmer, which is highly seasonal milk supply. You know, the reality is processing facilities are expensive. Farmers couldn't build them themselves. No farmer has the scale to go to market themselves, particularly in Ireland, because we have there's only 5 million people in the Republic of Ireland, so it's a very small domestic market. So we have to travel. And also within dairy, the cooperative model is good because dairy farmers can't be constantly negotiating conditions with third parties. If they're selling milk to a private company, it's always a worry, am I getting a good price? Will I consider selling to another company? Whereas if you're selling to your own cooperative, farmers are, I think, should be happier that they're getting a deal that's sustainable. So cooperation with dairy farmers makes sense. Just to understand the brief history, which is important in understanding our culture. We had traditionally, when we were ruled by Britain, we had traditionally supplied butter to Britain and the British Empire. Small farmers with 1 or 2 cows, they churned butter at home for sale to traders. But in the late 1800s was a very difficult time in Ireland after a famine where 1 million people died and 1 million people left the country. And there were social and structural difficulties. So we lost capacity in that market and lost influence in the market. The Danes, who organized themselves in Denmark, they became stronger in our traditional market, the UK market, because they had adopted the cooperative model earlier and we were being left behind. And there were new technologies emerging, which the Danes embraced because they had cooperatives. A man called Horace Plunkett started to establish cooperative creameries from about 1889 onwards. That's Horace. He established our organization. It was called the Irish Agricultural Organization Society. Then it changed its name afterwards. That was established in 1894. That was the type of creamery that he would establish. The evolution was quite slow and painful. In 1914, at the start of the First World War, there were over 1,000 small cooperatives with nearly 90,000 members. They were scattered around the country like that, very strange, clustered in the south and in the north, very little in the east and very little in the west. Dairy farming typically suited smaller farmers with less fertile, slightly less fertile type soils, which suited the north and the south. In the east, the land was better and the farms were bigger, so they didn't need to have 1 or 2 cows, so they were large grazing farms. And in the west, the soils were too small and the soils were too wet. So the land was too good in the east and too bad in the west, and it just happened to suit the south and the north, an accident of history. But they were difficult times in rural Ireland. We had a war of independence, and then we had a civil war, and very many of the cooperatives failed, because a cooperative isn't a license to success, unless it's efficient and unless the economic circumstances are correct, it will fail just like a company can fail. So actually, there was a state company established in 1927 to rescue lots of failed cooperative creameries and some private creameries. So the Irish state, after it was established in 1921, 1922, one of the first state companies that is established was called the Dairy Disposal Company, which rescued some failed cooperatives, which failed in the difficult years after independence. And that company existed until 1974, when some of the larger cooperatives regained control over the industry. So we had a slow and painful evolution until the 1970s, when we joined the EEC. Just again, to understand the evolution of cooperatives in Ireland, after we joined the EEC, there was a large investment in technology. So before that, farmers produced milk. They brought the milk to the local cooperative, where it was churned and the cream was taken off to make butter, and the farmer took home the skim milk to feed pigs. That was the model that survived for many decades. So only in the early 70s was there investments in technology, where they put in dryers to make more modern products. Again, supply doubled from 73 to 83. Then we had the quotas. Because we had the quotas and we had no growth for 30 years, actually those existing cooperatives, which were dairy cooperatives, evolved into other businesses. They got into pig farming, they got more involved in agribusiness and retail, into animal feed milling, into consumer foods, and energy. And those are just 2 of the types of outlets that cooperatives run. The upper one is owned by a cooperative called Arrivo, and that's one of their hardware garden centre outlets. Also at those outlets, the traditional farmer customer can buy feed and fertilizer, but the non-farmer can also buy plants for the garden or nice things for their house. And another one of our cooperatives has made lots of investments in the pharmacy business. So people can buy their medicines in pharmacies owned by the cooperative. And that's, the current layout of the dairy cooperative sector within Ireland. Just to understand the other sectors in which cooperatives are active. So dairy is number 1. Probably 80% of the economic activity within cooperatives in Ireland is within the dairy cooperatives. I should also explain, though, that those dairy cooperatives, as I mentioned, they sell dairy products. They're involved in agri-trading, agricultural supply, but they're also the biggest purchasers of cereals in Ireland as well. So about 65% of the cereal production in Ireland, which is only small, only about 2 million tonnes, but about 65% of that is also purchased by the cooperatives. They started as dairy cooperatives, but they also purchase the grain because they're involved in the malting business, or beer production, or in animal feed manufacture. The other sectors that the cooperatives are involved in are livestock marts, which are auction markets for selling of live cattle or sheep. There are about 80 of those nationally. Most of them are cooperatives. They turn over about €1 billion in sales of animals, either from one farmer to another or or to an agent of an abattoir. They also sell about 500,000 sheep. There are livestock breeding cooperatives, so either cattle breeding co-ops which run artificial insemination businesses. There are also breed societies, so beef breeds or dairy breeds. So those the herd book or the breeding structure is run by cooperatives. There are farm service cooperatives. So there's a farm relief cooperative network which provides skilled labour or specialised agricultural services to farmers. There are farm accounts cooperatives. Milk recording is provided by cooperatives for dairy farmers who measure the quality or the volume of their milk supply of individual cows. Other rural co-ops include group water schemes. So in very many parts of rural Ireland, where the local authorities don't provide water services, they're actually provided by local cooperatives called group water schemes. There are forestry cooperatives. As I said earlier, forestry is quite small in Ireland. Most of the forestry has been planted in the last 30 years, probably. It's commercial Sitka spruce plantations, but for the forestry that's owned by farmers, the small farmer-owned plantations, they have established some cooperatives to help manage the forestry and market the timber. We have fisheries cooperatives, and we have new types of cooperatives being established in new areas like energy, like carbon farming, community development, and now in new media. So particularly since COVID has affected us, whole sectors of the economy, I guess, have been damaged due to COVID restrictions, and we have a lot of cooperatives or potential cooperatives now coming to ICOS wondering could they use the cooperative model to re-establish supply chains that have been damaged by COVID restrictions, really. And that's one of the types of structure. That's a livestock market where animals are sold by auction. But we've had failures too. So co-op sector has been successful after about 100 years of testing. It's now been successful in the dairy sector, but it was very unsuccessful in meat processing. Co-ops had been involved in both in pig meat production, in beef processing, and in sheep meat processing. They're not involved, except one cooperative is still involved in pig meat processing, but no other cooperatives are involved. So they all got out of that business over the last probably 30 years, 25, 30 years. There are lots of reasons given for why cooperatives haven't been successful in the meat industry, because meat production is our second biggest export in agriculture. So dairy processing is now our biggest export of over 4 billion euros, but a very close second, over 3 billion euros, is meat, mostly beef. But cooperatives don't process meat, don't export meat. They used to, but they don't do it anymore. Reasons that have been given for why cooperatives just haven't been successful in meat processing. People have said cooperatives are too inefficient, perhaps they're too slow. Some people say they're too honest. There is a low return on investment in the meat industry. Perhaps it's most suited to a private company that's owned by one individual. But maybe the biggest reason is that cooperatives find it difficult to take sometimes a tough stance with their members, whereas a private company doesn't care. So our meat industry, our beef industry, is dominated by, in Ireland, private companies, private family companies, who are probably better positioned to compete in the red meat industry than cooperatives are. Producer organizations, I was asked just to comment on those. We do have producer organizations, particularly under EU regulations. We have actually 3 now involved in mushrooms, in horticulture production. So we have 3 producer organizations in mushrooms. So they are cooperatives that we have established, which are also registered producer organizations. So they're producer organizations under EU regulation, but they also need to have a corporate structure in Ireland, and a corporate structure that suits best is a cooperative. So we have established 3 cooperative producer organizations in horticulture. There are a number of producer organizations in fishing. I think there are 6 large producer organizations in fishing in Ireland. Some of them are companies registered under the Companies Act, and some of them are cooperatives registered under our IPS Act. But they are producer organizations under EU law. In dairy, in 2013, producer organizations were provided for under EU law to allow farmers who weren't members of cooperatives to negotiate collectively with customers for milk. You may or may not be aware, but you know, under competition law, certainly in Ireland and in most of Europe, it is illegal for 2 or 3 people to come together to negotiate a price with their customer, unless they're in a cooperative. So, you know, 3 or 5, 7 dairy farmers can come together to negotiate with a customer if they're in a cooperative, or 7,000 can come together if they're in a cooperative. But in countries where either culturally the cooperatives haven't been successful, or for traditional historic reasons, like probably exist in most of Eastern Europe, where the cooperative model was a source of some distrust in the European community or the European Union, legislated for producer organizations to do the same thing as cooperatives. So we had discussions with our Department of Agriculture as to whether producer organizations were needed in Ireland, and the decision was made that they weren't necessary in Ireland in dairy, because we had cooperatives which did the same thing. In beef, the beef industry in Ireland has been suffering over the last number of years with a large amount of distrust between about 60,000 farmers who produce cattle for sale for beef, and probably 5 or 6 privately owned companies that process and export the beef. A lot of distrust, and farmers feel that the prices that they're getting aren't high enough. Cooperatives, as I said before, had been in that sector and had failed. So there has been lots of discussions as to whether producer organizations, if they were established in the beef sector, might allow farmers to have a stronger position. The debate is still running. We don't know whether it's successful or not, whether it will be successful. We would make the argument that our livestock market cooperatives are producer organizations, and that they should be negotiating prices for cattle with the meat factories, with the meat factory companies. But that debate is still running. I was asked earlier just to comment in relation to product development, and whether the cooperative model was a good platform for our export sector for innovation and product development. I think it's fair to say that a cooperative, as I said earlier, just because you're a cooperative doesn't mean that you'll be successful. The entity, the company, has to be efficient and innovative, whether it's a cooperative or otherwise. And just because you're a cooperative isn't a license for success. Our cooperatives in the dairy sector, the products that they produce, as we saw on a slide earlier, they are largely a commodity type product, in that they are a product with a high dry matter that can be stored and shipped around the world. So we make butter, we make cheese, we make powder, we make infant formula. If you were to visit an Irish supermarket, what you would notice is on the dairy shelf, there is a lot of liquid milk, because we do consume a lot of liquid milk per person, but there's only 5 million of us, so we only consume 6% of our total milk. But of the other fresh dairy products, chilled dairy products that you'll see on the shelf, the yogurt products and the dairy drink products, they're all imported. They're not domestic products, or the vast majority of them are imported. So the brands that you'll see on the dairy shelves in Ireland, although leaving aside liquid milk, the brands that you'll see are Nestle and Danone and Muller, and Lactalis, I guess, as well. They're not domestic brands. That's because our domestic market is too small. We're 5 million people. So it's actually, if you are a cooperative in Ireland processing 1 billion litres of milk, you know, how much of your product could you turn into yogurt for the domestic market? A couple of percent. It's a tiny percentage of your total volume that would be devoted to, you know, yogurt for the domestic market. And it costs a lot of money to develop a brand. And what happens in the domestic market is those international players who have developed brands all around Europe, they just dump that into the domestic market. So it's a better investment for our cooperatives to say, no, we'll just build a big factory to make cheese or make butter or make powder to ship the product to China or the US or North Africa or Germany. So the model is built around the needs of the farmer. The farmer doesn't need to have his milk turned into yogurt for the domestic market. The farmer just needs to have his milk collected and paid and get a good price and get it promptly, and not to be told, I'm sorry, we're only paying you for 80% of your milk or 70% of your milk, or we don't want all your milk. In Ireland, one of the rules in our co-op rule books, as I explained earlier, we have a rule book. One of the rules is that the cooperative shall purchase all the milk produced by the member. Shall purchase. So the cooperative has to. So in many other countries, if a farmer wants to increase their milk supply, the company will say, no, sorry, we don't want the extra milk. In Ireland, the cooperative shall, they must. So that's what the key feature of a cooperative is. It is a democratic entity where it's one member, one vote. The key decisions are made by a board who are elected from the members, and the cooperative does what's in the interests of the members. In order to be able to afford to pay a good milk price, they must be efficient, they must be effective, they must be innovative, they must make good products to go to export markets. But the reason they do that is so that they can collect the farmer's milk and pay a good price. For some reason, that has been successful in dairy because of the nature of the production, the nature of the relationship. It has been unsuccessful in beef. And I don't know whether it's the best model for lots of other production, but I know it works well with our circumstances. And also it works well in farmer support. So I mentioned earlier, farm relief service, farm accounts, dairy breeding, beef breeding, animal marketing. It's a very good model for farm support, where your aim is to support the farmer, and you need to make profit, obviously. But the cooperatives have been successful there too. So thank you for listening. I'll certainly take any questions if anybody has them.
Super. Thanks very much. That was excellent. Exactly what we were hoping for. I have a couple of questions which I've collected previously. I'll see if we get any questions on the chat subsequently. First of all, we have a question which I'll go straight to from Natalia Pismena. Can you see the questions in the chat?
Yeah. Who can be a member of the cooperative? Are they just farmers or other producers? What's the main condition for creating a cooperative, for example? Okay, so who can be a member? Within a rule book, typically it says anybody who can supply the cooperative and lives within the area can be a member. So that's the legal position. However, it's also within the rule book that the board has the absolute discretion as to whether they admit somebody or not. They, under Irish law, are prohibited from discriminating under any one of the, I think, 9 criteria for discrimination, you know, race, gender, all these discriminations. But the board have the absolute discretion. But anybody who can be a member. So I'm not a dairy farmer. So if I were to apply to my local dairy cooperative to join, they'd say, well, no, you're not a dairy farmer. You have no economic interest. But if somebody next door to me who purchased a farm and started to become a dairy farmer, they could apply and they would be admitted. So legally, anybody who can be a member and resides within the area. So if you're 300 kilometers away and you say, I want to join you, they say, well, we're not going to send a truck 300 kilometers. So no, you can't join. So only farmers, Yes, only farmers in an agricultural cooperative. What is the main condition for creating a cooperative? So within Ireland, to register as a cooperative, our current law says you must have 7 special members. I'm conscious that there's an EU statute, there's a European cooperative law that you can establish a cooperative under European law, which says 5 members, but the Irish Act says 7. I mentioned earlier that we expect to get a new act, some new piece of legislation, which is coming slowly, and I think that will say 5 as well, because 5 is more the European law. But for now, our rules say 7 special members. For example, in Ukraine, this is the presence of a farm among the members of a cooperative. Yeah, so to establish a cooperative, you need 7 special members, and you need a rule book, which typically ICOS will write for you. And you need if somebody applies to ICOS to establish a cooperative, we ask them, have they 7 special members, and can they grow that? And we ask for a business plan. We don't want to establish a cooperative that's going to fail, because if you establish a cooperative, you have 7 people, and you try to raise money, you try to raise capital. So people need to put their money together to build something. We need to see a business plan so that in 2 years' time, the thing doesn't fail. And then people come to ICOS and say, where's my money? So we need to see a business plan. So it needs to have some economic basis. And it needs to abide by, there are 7 cooperative principles in the International Cooperative Alliance around what cooperatives should do. And one of them is independence and autonomy, which sounds like a pretty high notion. But what it is that the cooperative can be its own thing. It can't be controlled by a third party. So we need to see that if somebody comes to us and says, oh, I want to set up a cooperative because I have a business and these are the people that are going to supply me and I want to set up a cooperative for them, we say, we want to talk to them. You can't control this thing. You can't set up a co-op to suit you. We want to talk to the people who are going to be members. So it needs to have independence and autonomy, and it can't be controlled by a third party. What percentage of farmers in Ireland are members of co-ops? In the dairy sector, about 98% of the milk is purchased by either co-ops or companies that are owned by co-ops. So we'll say the cooperative family. So there are two of our larger dairy companies are actually companies, public companies, which the original co-op owns a substantial stake in. So we still count them as being within the cooperative model. So 98% of dairy farmers are members of or would supply cooperatives. Lots of other farmers then who are in beef or in cereals would be members of either the dairy cooperatives as well, because they maybe traditionally their family was producing some milk, and certainly the cereal farmers who sell their cereals to the dairy cooperatives would be members as well. So I would say there's about 65,000 farmers who are members of the cooperatives, of one cooperative or another, which is the majority of farmers.
Colin, we can't hear you, old boy. Turn your mic. You're muted.
Okay, TJ, just in relation to, you mentioned earlier on that a lot of the co-ops sell their milk to some of the larger co-ops who make yogurts, and that some of the international companies make yogurts. But it's a lot of the Irish companies also have their own brands, successful brands of yogurts like Glambia in Ireland and Kerry.
Glambia used to be very active in the yogurt business, but they've actually ceased it because
I didn't realize that.
The market was too small. There's really only one yogurt manufacturer in Ireland now, which isn't a cooperative. It's a private company. They buy their
Glenisc.
Well, Glenisc are smaller.
Yeah.
West Cork yogurt. So they buy their milk and their cream. So they're a private company. They buy the milk and the cream from a cooperative, but they're a private company. And yes, Glenisk is a private company as well, but they, I think, have Danone is a large shareholder in that company.
That's large, all right, yeah.
Domestic market is...
buy, because they've got their own farms. Did they buy outside farmers as well?
They do buy from farmers as well, yeah. But it's a tiny percentage of the national production.
Yeah.
Again,
I understand
people, we don't eat much yogurt. There's only so much we can consume.
I just wanted to ask one final question regarding, quite naturally, you've been talking mainly about the dairy and also the meat industry, and you also said that you weren't sure about how useful the cooperative mechanism would be in other supply chains. But I mean, purely what I have said is that essentially at least the principles of which are applied to those particular industries should apply theoretically to other supply chains. And so what I'm trying to say is that the market infrastructure issues that challenge family dairy farms are essentially the same market infrastructure, market access issues that also challenge potato producers or plum growers or small, medium-sized raspberry growers, etc. Would you agree with that? The fact that the Irish successes are in the dairy industry is more to do with the Irish agricultural sector rather than the cooperative mechanism.
I would. I'd probably go back to first principles, though. The human condition. We're all pretty independent. We like to control our own destiny. I would say, whilst the cooperative model is wonderful, and it is wonderful, I think everybody's first preference will be to do it themselves rather than to pool. Whilst we're social animals, so everybody's first preference is to do it themselves. The cooperative model has its roots in market failure.
Yeah.
So where the market fails, then I think it's because either there are technological issues, there are scale issues, or there are dominance issues. So if there's a technology that you need and you can't get it, if you're a raspberry grower and there's a particular piece of kit that you need that you can't access yourself, then the question is, can I work with 12 other or 20 or 30 other raspberry growers to get that piece of kit? If there's a scale issue, if I produce 10 tons and I need 1,000 tons, well, are there 99 others where we can come together? Or if there are market dominance issues where there is a player, a customer who buys your raspberries, who doesn't treat you well, and can you say, well, what if me and all the other raspberry growers come together? But we're not just going to come together and burn down the factory.
No.
We're going to come together in some sort of a coherent, democratic, rules-based structure where everybody knows the rules and everybody's treated fairly, and we run an efficient business. So all those bits have to be right. It worked well. The cooperative model worked well in dairy in Ireland because there was market failure. We didn't have scale. We didn't have technology. And actually, there were probably market dominance issues as well. The cooperative model, there is definitely market failure in the beef sector in Ireland as well. But there are just structural issues whereby the cooperatives, if I have cattle, if I produce 100 cattle a year, I'm probably only going to sell them on one day. At the end of the year, I'm going to ring the factory and say, what's the best price you give me? If you bring together 100 producers and they say, right, we're going to have 100 by 100, we've got 10,000 cattle. All the factory has to do is ring me and ring you and ring somebody else and say, I'll give you a slightly better price. You sell them to me. And then I go. And then the unity breaks down. And that's what's happened in the beef sector. Whereas in the dairy sector, you can't sell for a better price today and because you're selling every day. So
every day.
You need market failure for a cooperative to work because we'd all do it ourselves if we could. When you do have market failure and you set up an efficient business, it succeeds.
Super. No, that's perfect. Natalia Pismina has written another question. Do you have a couple of minutes to answer that one as well?
Yeah, no problem. Are there rules and model charters for the cooperative? Yes. So as I said, there is a the rule book, which is an ICOS rule book that all the cooperatives have. So we set out with, so if somebody wants to establish a cooperative, depending on whether it's in energy or dairy and livestock, we have model rule books for different sectors. So they're all fundamentally based on traditional rule book, but they contain different elements depending on the sector that you're in. So yes, we have model rule books for very many sectors. So we have model rule books for forestry, we have model rule books now we're developing them for energy co-ops. We've only a few of them. So they are available. So a set of model rules. And then if a group comes to us and says, we want to, for instance, we've had one cooperative recently that set up who want to develop carbon farming. So effectively who wants to pool some resources around land and forestry and want to put in some metrics so they can see how much carbon they're sequestering and to sell it ultimately. So we have a model rule book that will suit them, but then we sit down with them and we say, okay, what are the important elements of your business? So let's amend the rules to suit that, and then we get those rules registered with the government. So do cooperatives buy agricultural products from their members? Well, they buy milk and they buy grain, and in some instances they buy cattle from their members. And then they sell inputs, feed, fertilizer, artificial insemination straws, hardware, inputs. What tax benefits do cooperatives have? This is probably a difficult one because they have very few tax benefits. Colm O'Cribbin is on the line from the Department of Agriculture, so I can complain here. One of the difficulties we have in Ireland is that there is no positive treatment of the shares in a cooperative. So if you are a farmer and you are a dairy farmer and you need to buy shares in your cooperative, because there is a requirement in most cooperatives that you have shares linked to the volume of production that you have. So in most cooperatives in Ireland, there is a requirement that you have shares, about 3 euro cents of shares per litre of annual production. So if you produce 500,000 litres, which is the average production, you need 15,000 shares to own 15,000 shares. It's not a lot, but it's, and you don't have to buy it all up front. You can purchase it over perhaps 3 years. But that co-op share has to be bought out of your after-tax income. It's not tax deductible. So it costs you twice as much, really. So we have, for years, sought some recognition of the fact that the co-op share is an input. It's like a milking parlour. It's like a refrigerated boat tank. It's a cost of doing business. It should be after tax. It should be a before tax expenditure. But no, you pay out of your after-tax income, which is, we feel, unfair, but so be it. It is what it is. Having said that, when you sell your shares afterwards, when you retire, you don't pay tax on that then, because tax is already paid. Mm-hmm. There aren't really benefits from the user's viewpoint. Obviously, cooperatives as incorporated entities have the full range of corporation tax issues like every company has, so they pay tax at corporation tax levels.
Super, that's excellent. Mr. O'Cribbin, would you like to say anything at this stage?
Thanks, TJ. I don't remember seeing that when I was in economics and planning. If you put in the suggestion into Sean there, I'm sure he'd be more than willing to have a look at it. But as you said, tax has to be paid at some point. If it's not paid early on, it'll have to be paid after the retirement. And maybe issues on that side as well. Yeah.
Super. Okay. Many thanks to everybody this morning. If there are any further questions or comments anybody would like to make, please let us know now. Otherwise, I'll just mention that we have one more state institutional meeting tomorrow. So we'll be hearing from Mr. Sean Bell from the Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine. That's the Irish Ministry. And on the 24th, we'll be hearing from Onua, which is the Kerrygold brand owner, so a private company, which is
well, it's a cooperative.
It's a cooperative. I knew it was a cooperative. I didn't know if it still is a cooperative. But yeah, I mean, this is one of the shining examples of a cooperative that's become, you know, a world beater around the world. That's one of the reasons why I thought it would be very interesting to talk to you guys. This is, I don't know if it can be called a model, but it's certainly a very good example of how a cooperative can grow to be a global leader in.
Just Richard, just so you understand.
Onua brand is, Richard, the Onua brand is prominently listed on the first or second slide of TJ's presentation.
Yeah.
And just so you understand, Onua is a cooperative, but it's what we call a secondary cooperative.
Mm-hmm.
Members aren't the farmers, its members are the other cooperatives. So farmers are members of their local cooperative, and then the cooperative is a member of Onua.
Okay, that's super.
It's secondary, but it's a cooperative anyway.
It is a cooperative and registered. Yeah. Super. Okay, everybody, I'm aware of time and time constraints. So as I say, upcoming tomorrow, the ministry, and next Tuesday, Onua. Thank you very much, Mr. Flanagan, for your contribution this morning. That was excellent. If you're happy, we'd like to translate your presentation. If you could send it to us in PowerPoint and send to the participants and put it on our website, as well as the video recording of this, if you're happy for us to do that.
No problem.
And if anybody has any subsequent questions, if they can come to me and I can pass them on to you, if that's okay. I'm pretty sure that although Natalia Pismena didn't ask, she would be interested if there are any rule books, etc., which are publicly available and are not subject to intellectual property issues. You know, it's very useful for people here to see successful examples. So anything you can share with us in that respect would be very useful. But of course, I understand if there are intellectual property issues in that respect. Yeah, no, the rule books are intellectual properties. Okay. We can't share them unless there's a and the draft law, which is upcoming, I guess that's also not a public document at this stage. And would you recommend looking at the current Irish law, or is it better to? Yeah, no. I part of the problem is the current Irish law is like several phone books, and it's an 1893 law which has been amended 50 times. Exactly. So that's what we want, was a new law, which it isn't. It's we haven't. The draft heads of bill hasn't been published yet, but we had it before Christmas. Okay. But when it is published, I mean, it'll be available and everybody, and it'll be tidier. Excellent. Well, good luck with that anyway. Many thanks for your contributions and for your time this morning. No problem. And hopefully maybe next year we'll have a chance to talk face to face. Thank you. Thanks again for everybody. And for those of you who can, see you tomorrow morning. Cheerio for now. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.